Today's episode is brought to you by Freedom Project Academy. Looking for a K-12 classical online school built on Judeo-Christian values? FPA is enrolling now for the fall. Request your free information packet at freedomforschool.com. That's freedom, F-O-R, school.com.
It's time to get educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. This is the Dr. Duke Show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we get started, as always, hit that share button so we can share. All right, we're kicking things off with our good friend Vicki McKenna for CultureCast. Vicki, so good to see you.
Great to see you.
Well, you know, this next story that we're going to talk about kind of tickles me a little bit. I've been a 30-year university professor, and I cannot tell you how nauseating it is to be around actual liberal academics. The smug, the intolerance, the hypocrisy, the idea that they're the most tolerant people in the room while they're shutting down and canceling everybody who disagrees. Absolutely. And now we have evidence. Take a look at this wonderful exchange between Josh Hawley and a professor, an overheated professor, who I wonder where she got her PhD from. Take a look at this.
Professor Bridges, you said several times, you've used a phrase, I want to make sure I understand what you mean by it. You've referred to people with a capacity for pregnancy. Would that be women?
Many women, cis women, have the capacity for pregnancy. Many cis women do not have the capacity for pregnancy. There are also trans men who are capable of pregnancy, as well as non-binary people who are capable of pregnancy.
So this isn't really a women's rights issue.
We can recognize that this impacts women while also recognizing that it impacts other groups. Those things are not mutually exclusive, Senator Hawley.
Oh, so your view is that the core of this right then is about what?
So I want to recognize that your line of questioning is transphobic, and it opens up trans people to violence by not recognizing that.
Wow, you're saying that I'm opening up people to violence by asking whether or not women are the folks who can have pregnancies?
So I want to note that 1 out of 5 transgender persons have attempted suicide. So I think it's important.
Because of my line of questioning? So we can't talk about it?
Because denying that trans people exist and pretending not to know that they exist.
I'm denying that trans people exist by asking you if you're talking about women having pregnancies?
Do you believe that men can get pregnant?
No, I don't think women can get
So
pregnant.
you are denying that trans people exist?
And that leads to violence? Is this how you run your classroom? Are students allowed to question you?
Absolutely.
Or are they also treated like this, where
No,
they're told that they're opening up people to violence?
We have a good time in my class. You should join.
I bet.
You might learn a lot.
Vicki, are you?
It's hard to even know where to begin on this. First, she actually stated that women and then other groups, but those other groups she was defining as women. So the first thing she did was manage to tie herself into a knot by claiming that women can get pregnant, but then other groups can as well. But she had just said previously that those other groups were in fact women. So and then finally just cop to it. You don't think men can get pregnant? Senator Hawley says, no, of course I don't think that men can get pregnant. And then of course it was proof positive that he's a transphobic person who's trying to erase the existence of trans people and wants to visit violence on them. I mean, raise your hand if that makes sense. The only people that make sense to, and they don't really think it makes sense, are the people like Kiara Bridges, who have lived their entire lives in activism or academia. But to 99% of the rest of the nation, that was just nonsense. And you know what? You're paying $50,000 a year or more now to expose your children to that nonsense. Because my guess is, and do correct me if I'm wrong, she's more common than uncommon on college campuses.
She is the prototype, archetypal professor now these days. It's amazing, too, that these professors have no core knowledge. These aren't historians, they're not philosophers, they're not literature professors, they're not sociologists, they're literally just race-baiting activists. And that's all it takes. That's all it takes to become a professor these days, is the right, anguished, tortured view of culture. And let me throw this out real quickly while we're at this. Notice what she also said, too. The idea that if you disbelieve so that trans people can be whatever they want to be, that makes you a bigot. So there's a long list of things.
It makes you a violent bigot who wants trans people to die.
Can trans men menstruate? Of course, you got to answer. It's a socialist checklist of alternative truths, right? Whatever the party, in this case the progressives, whatever they say, that's the truth.
Yeah, and notice that she wasn't even bothered by the fact that she had actually contradicted herself, or bothered by the fact that what she was saying was just pure nonsense in a complete, disregard of actual reality. Reality, the irreality, surreality that we are supposed to accept. We are supposed to accept, or we're criminals of some kind, or we're so fundamentally immoral we ought to be criminals of some kind. I mean, that's where they've got you. They've got you in a place where you can never argue because they don't want to argue, because they can't actually present an argument or anything that looks like a debate for their position. So they insist that their reality is one that you have to acquiesce to. And if you don't, you're a bad person. And you're a bad person in some cases that ought to be considered criminally bad. So, I mean, this is how they confound and confuse people, is just by simply, deciding that a fantasy is reality and then forcing you to accept their fantasy every step of the way as it changes on the fly even. Yeah,
as a professor, I can underscore what you just wrote. It's not the quality of your argument. It's not the evidence and the empirical truth that you present to these people. It's this mere fact that you're arguing with them that makes you a bigot. It doesn't matter.
Exactly true. And look what Hawley did. He was very gentle. He was polite. He was waiting for her to try to explain herself. But she just simply kept changing the topic ever so slightly. So he's asking whether or not men can get pregnant. He's asking, what is this idea of people with the capacity for pregnancy? Are you talking about women? She immediately shifts to accusing him of wanting trans people to commit suicide or visiting violence on trans people. And then he tries to bring her back to the original point, and she continues to try to move to slightly shift reality just enough so that she never actually has to answer a question.
After the break, I want to take this conversation a little bit further, because there are other aspects of what our good professor said that really need to be challenged. We'll see you on the other side.
With all the censorship taking place on social media platforms, we've made it easy to keep up with your favorite content. Simply download the Freedom Project Media app in your app store. Get access to 18 new videos a week, plus thousands of archived shows, lecture series, and educational animations. Download the Freedom Project Media app on your Apple TV, Roku, tablet, or phone, and make sure you allow for notifications to keep you informed.
Back again with Vicki McKenna for the second part of our conversation. The other thing, Vicki, before we let this go, and I think this absolutely has to be pointed out, because people are terrified of making the point I'm about to make. She said that you denied trans rights by asking if women are the only ones who can get pregnant. So we already handled that in the first part of the first segment. However, she then turned around and she said, "This is why trans people are killing themselves. I want to challenge that." How do you know that, Professor? How do you know that? Because trans people are continuing to kill themselves over the fact that we have over-recognized them now. We have given them so much recognition, so many rights, so many opportunities. In 5 years, by the way. In 5 years. Fashion. And they're still killing themselves. I would have loved to have been sitting where Hawley was and said to her, "You know what? How do you know these people are mentally ill and not trans suffering?" It seems to me that we're so much more understanding than we have ever been, and yet the suicides continue. But the idea,
isn't it weird? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Isn't it weird? You've got now affirmation is the demand, that instead of saying this is something called gender dysphoria, this is just your identity. And by the way, your identity at age 3 or age 5, you're not supposed to do anything except affirm, affirm, affirm. That's what the left is saying. Affirm whatever reconstruction of reality somebody decides to create because they're trying to hide from something, some kind of mental pain, some kind of trauma. Don't address trauma. Why would we address trauma? Trauma is, has nothing to do with people, I don't know, picking up rifles and murdering children in classrooms. That has nothing to do with trauma, right? So let's never address the trauma and just affirm. And so, yes, you have an alarmingly high number of people who have declared themselves trans committing suicide. But instead of actually trying to figure out where that trauma is coming from, instantly the left automatically blames a lack of people who want to practice the affirmation and accept the altered reality. I haven't seen a trans person run into a trans person, had a conversation with a trans person in 10 years, but somehow I'm responsible for mentally distressed people killing themselves, even though the entire culture has now been forced to bend one knee and acquiesce to a reality that does not exist, just to make mentally traumatized people feel better, and it doesn't appear to be doing any good.
And you think about this too. We understand that homosexuals in this culture do have a slightly higher suicide rate than non-heterosexuals. But however, than heterosexuals. And however, can you imagine how illogically and stupid it would sound if people made the argument gay people are killing themselves because we haven't recognized homosexuality? Even that wouldn't be able to fly on the left. But when it comes to this, it seems to me that the smaller and the more inconsequential the minority group, the more the left has to elevate them to the biggest victims in the history of the world.
Yeah, so tell me why the entire culture has caved to this. This is something that I've been trying to figure out. Maybe 7 years ago when it first started to become a thing, trans started to become a thing during the Obama administration. And I said, this isn't going to work. And here's why it isn't going to work. Because women are not going to give up their locker rooms and their bathrooms. And men are not going to allow their daughters to be exposed to creepy men who wanted to declare themselves as women. I said openly 7 years ago, there's no way. And 9 months later, I had to eat my words because already the culture had started to fall. Already the dominoes had been tipped over and nobody was fighting back. Not dads, not parents. We've got a little bit of pushback at the school level at this point. But honestly, it's just stunning to me that it seems that everybody was, you're afraid? You're afraid of the purple-haired obese woman with the nose ring and the ear gauges and the neck tattoo who's telling you she's a man? You're afraid of her? What are you afraid of? That you might have to stare at those hideous features for a little bit longer? I mean, why are we so scared of people who honestly are dancing around demanding that we actually pretend like we're all stoned to accept their reality?
Yeah, in the first segment, you made the observation that 99% of people don't see the world the way this professor did. However, when you look at kids who are in the public school system right now, from 5 all the way through the graduation of high school seniors, you know what? That number is a lot lower than 99% because of the constant, relentless trans bullying that's taking place in the schools.
Yeah, and it works.
It works.
And it works because we've got kids that are, just because a girl is a tomboy, she's being told by counselors and she's being told by advisors or teachers that she's trans. And then there are groups out there that are looking to isolate kids like that and convince them that the source of their problems is that they're just simply the alternate gender. And then of course the policy is to affirm without even having the parents looped into any of the decision making or any of the exposure that the child is going to be experiencing. So yeah, I mean, you're right. When you indoctrinate someone, I mean, notice how it's worked across entire countries and cultures in the past to create totalitarian societies. This is essentially a sort of a microcosm of what we've seen happen on a much broader and more deadly scale. And it's just a matter of time, I think, before the next issue gets wrapped in. What's the next issue going to be? Right now it's trans. Pretty soon that's going to become boring. We're going to need something new.
Today's show is sponsored by our friends at MyPillow. Save up to 66% on all items at MyPillow.com when you use the code Dr. Duke. That's DRDUKE. Support this show by supporting a great American company.
Welcome back, Carter. Jimmy Carter, that is. Well, he's back in the news for a good reason this time, actually, as he and his wife, Rosalind, have been married for 76 years. Now, that's a huge accomplishment for anyone. But some Christian outlets are taking it a step further and suggesting that Carter is a kind of role model for the Christian life. Now, it's important to look at some of Carter's philosophies, statements, and political ideology to better understand some contradictions between what he says and what the Bible teaches. I'm David Fiorazzo, and this is Christ and Culture. The Carters were married in 1946. Wow. I know, that's quite an accomplishment. And in fact, theirs is the longest presidential marriage recorded. So kudos for staying together in a culture that now disrespects the institution of marriage and downplays the vital role of family. Sadly, however, Jimmy Carter's presidency is considered by most to be a failure. And he left office with one of the worst presidential approval ratings in history. I bet he's thankful, though, to see a president today with an even lower approval rating, as the country is suffering on nearly every front. Cost of living, gas prices, and inflation under Joe Biden's presidency are sitting at a 40-year high. So give Carter credit for a good marriage, yes, but don't put him or his secular worldview up on a pedestal as some Christian publications are doing, or they seem to be. That's right. Did you catch that? I said secular worldview. Carter seems to adhere to a philosophy of syncretism. Let's look at some facts. A professing Southern Baptist, Jimmy Carter supports abortion on some levels and fully endorses so-called marriage equality. He once revoked the status of Christian academies, labeling them as separatist, and said on several occasions that animosity toward former President Obama is always racism. People didn't like Obama because he's black. Carter, who taught Sunday school on occasion, actually said he doesn't have any verse in Scripture to back up this claim, but he somehow declared, quote, "I believe that Jesus would approve of gay marriage," end quote. Carter went on to say in an interview that, "I think Jesus would encourage any love affair if it was honest and sincere and was not damaging to anyone else, and I don't see that gay marriage damages anyone else." Just be sincere. It doesn't really matter what the Bible says or if the Bible supports it. Just be loving and define what you think is damaging to others, including young children, and do what you want. Your will be done. So please understand, I'm not bringing this up out of the blue to bash a former president. So why mention this at all then? Because people who don't know the Bible, and that's most of America, the context, by the way, you need to know in many scripture passages, and the worldview of Jimmy Carter, those people will assume that because he taught Bible Sunday school class at church, right? He represents all that Jesus taught. After all, the Bible does say that we are ambassadors for Christ. We represent him. So, several years ago, let's look at this. When Carter made news claiming that Jesus would approve of homosexuality, evangelist Franklin Graham responded at the time this way, quote, "I have to respectfully disagree with former President Jimmy Carter on this one. He is absolutely wrong when he said Jesus would approve of gay marriage. Jesus didn't come to promote sin. He came to save us from sin. The Bible is very clear. God destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of homosexuality. God defines sin in his word. It's not up to our opinion, the latest poll, or popular vote. What is very troubling is that some people may read what President Carter has said and believe it. That's simply why this is so important to address. Americans no longer understand what the Bible teaches. They don't read it. As a recent survey has proved, actually many surveys prove, their biblical worldview is nearly non-existent. Unfortunately, even pastors, church and youth leaders are also on the decline when it comes to a biblical worldview. So we need to get over some basic points, or we need to go over some basic points again and ask why over the last several decades has Jimmy Carter sided, for example, with far leftists such as Michael Moore, Sean Penn, Noam Chomsky, praising socialist regimes such as Venezuela? Aside from useful idiot social justice minions, the wealthy power elites that are critical of capitalism have done quite well for themselves, right? The Bible also teaches that nations who bless Israel will be blessed by God, and those who curse Israel will be cursed by God. That's Genesis 12:3. Now, Jimmy Carter has often been criticized for anti-Israel statements or for lacking understanding of foreign policy. Some say he is an anti-Semite. He once naively suggested, quote, "Peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when the Israeli government is willing to comply with international law. Just surrender. Come on, Israel. Bow down to the UN and those demanding compromise. If Israel does that, they will no longer exist. They'll no longer have a nation." That's Carter's philosophy. Next, back in 1998, the Southern Baptist Convention decreed that women must submit to their husbands and could not be pastors in church. Now, both ideas are biblical concepts, though proper context always helps. We don't have time to get into that. But the point is, former President Carter rejected this decision. Now, back to his misinterpretation of scriptures regarding sexual immorality and the definition of marriage. Carter said in 2012, 10 years ago, that homosexuality was well known in the ancient world. So? Does that make something right or holy just because it existed in past history? What kind of thinking is that? Jimmy Carter also wrongly claimed, quote, "Jesus never said a word about it," end quote. And he felt, Jesus would have felt, right, it would be fine for gay people to be married in civil ceremonies. That's what Carter said. Really. Let's look at just one passage because we're running out of time. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus affirmed creation, family, and he defines marriage. Quote, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God joined together, let not man separate." Mark chapter 10, verses 6 through 9. So let's look at just one more issue regarding Jimmy Carter's worldview, and that is there seems to be some confusion, not only biblically, but with the U.S. Constitution and Carter's view of the second biggest lie in America, the separation of church and state. Lie. It's not in the Constitution. Like many on the left, Carter seemed to believe the culture and the public square are no place for Christian influence or morality. He often noted that the Baptist Church was founded in part on that principle, staying out of politics and the public square. So according to sources, as president, Carter refused to even have prayer breakfasts in the White House. So if he did trust in Jesus and believe the whole counsel of God, the whole Bible, he decided not to let that view, his religious views, shape public policy. But that's impossible, to divorce your faith from your actions and how you live your life. That's called compartmentalizing your faith. You can't leave Jesus in the car and go in and pull a lever in the voting booth, for example. Carter struggled at times during his presidency to reconcile his faith with his secularist philosophy. Let me remind you, Colossians 2:8 says this, "See to it that there is no one who takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception in accordance with human tradition." And it goes on. Now, there's a big contradiction here. We cannot separate our biblical worldview from our politics or our actions. Faith without works is useless, James 2:20. Moreover, the Bible is not ambiguous when it comes to sexual immorality and what it teaches. If you are truly a born-again believer in Jesus Christ and obey his word, your life will clearly reflect your faith. We are to be salt and light. God bless you, and keep speaking the truth about things that matter.
I'd like to take a moment and end this show by featuring a question submitted by one of our viewers. Matthew writes, quote, "How do you recommend parents talk about Roe versus Wade to our children? In my case, an 8 and a 6-year-old. Matthew, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for the question. Honestly, to be very honest with you, I wouldn't talk to a 6-year-old about any of this. I mean, we're talking about a first grader. I would not talk about it. I think it's too young, and honestly, I'm not sure I would talk about it to an 8-year-old. Let them be children. Now, if on the other hand, Matthew, if that's preemptive, right, that you want to talk to them now so they don't hear the wrong things, you want to be the one who introduces this subject to your kids, I wouldn't do that. I would let them be children. However, if they are already being exposed to this, if they're coming home from their first grade or their third grade classrooms and they're asking you, Daddy, what is Roe versus Wade? That's another issue. And at that point, I think what I would do is I would try to talk them down from the political angle about this. I would start by saying, look, these are big people political arguments. And when people are dealing with politics, they often say things that are very extreme and do things that are very extreme. So first thing I want to tell you guys is to not oversweat this. It'll become clearer as you get older. However, we have two kinds of things going on in the country right now. One is there's a lot of people who want to protect babies. And we do that because babies are the most vulnerable people in the world. Think about your young brother. Tell the 8-year-old. Think about how protective you are of your 6-year-old brother. If somebody was bullying or threatening your 6-year-old brother, you would do what you had to do to protect him, wouldn't you? And you know the 8-year-old's going to say yes. And say, well, think about unborn babies. Think about the littlest babies who have just been born. Who's going to protect their rights? And there's a lot of people in this country who want to protect those rights, and then there are a lot of people in this country who don't think they have any. And that's the injustice. That's why we believe in protecting young life and not exposing it to bullying and worse things still. That's the best I can do for you. I hope that works.
If you have a question for Dr. Duke and Katie, please send it our way by emailing askduke@fpeusa.org.
And that's going to do it for this show. I'm Dr. Duke, and until next time, stay educated, my friends.